every time there's a trade union meeting, somebody will say unity is strength, somebody will say solidarity. But these things aren't values or buzzwords to get a clap in a room. These are definite practical steps that don't fall out of the sky. They're not a feeling you get when you see someone on the picket line and there's a twinkle in their eye and all of that. They come about through hard work and organisation. So we have got to do the same thing as our class enemies. We have got to have a strategy, a common set of aims and a strategy to deliver it. Now, in these disputes over the past year, we had a strategy in the RMT, and like any strategy, you've sometimes got to adopt that and change it as you move through different phases of a strike, but it was fairly simple. Get into dispute. Number one, you can't do nothing if you're not in the ring, so get into the ring and start scrapping. Number two, make the argument, not just for our own members, but for our class. Everyone's in the same boat. They want to divide us from everyone else and pitch nurses against railway workers and railway workers against posties. So our counter is, we'll make the argument for all of them. We're all in the same boat. Nobody's seeing their living standards improve. All of our public services are in a dire state and literally falling down now, as we've seen. So we would make the argument that was a class argument. And what we would do is try and stay in the ring and keep fighting until we can encourage and inspire and hopefully bring other trade unions into the ring with us to increase the size of our ranks and reduce the impact of their strategy. That was it. Now, that worked up to a point. Some people have started to settle, and it's not their fault. The pressures that are on workers in this country, the pressures that are on trade unions, are very difficult. But that was our basic strategy for this dispute. And I think that's the guts of what we've got to do going forward. Now, there's a motion on the conference floor from the CWU, I think is the most important motion here in this conference. I think what we've got to do is democratise our TUC. We have got to coordinate around a common set of demands, and we've got to have a strategy, just like they do. I was taught when I became a trade unionist, it all comes down to one thing. Who's better organised? Us or them? If they're better organised with us, then we're going to get worse wages, poorer terms and conditions and less jobs. But if we're organised better than them in the workplace, we'll have better wages and they'll have less profits. And that is the basics of it. And I don't think this changes whether you're marching to London with Wat Tyler or whether you're here at the TUC in Liverpool. I think that's the guts of it. So we have got to get a strategy, and it's got to be on the basis of arguing around a common set of demands that we know resonates with the public. We know the mass of people support our demands because our demands are in their interests. It's not in their interests to privatise the NHS. It's not in their interests to have no council housing and everyone's tied to the casino property market. It's not in their interests to have our energy in the hands of profiteers and old people worried about paying their bills. It's not in the interests of anyone to see people going to food banks or kids to be hungry. So our message is the right one, that we know has got mass support. We have got to get our message out there in a coordinated way. That's it. Get the message out there, put the demands forward, and let's start to coordinate, because the thing that has held us back as a movement for generation after generation is sectionalism and parochial interests, people arguing about their own particular patch. Now, we have got to have a strategy that means we're not just going to fight, but we're going to fight smart. So one of the things I saw in the course of that dispute is what the government was worried about and what they weren't worried about. There are key parts of our economy that they are worried about. And there are parts of our economy, I have to say, no disrespect to any trade union in the country, that frankly they're not. So there are places, if we take strike action, will have an economic impact and will cause significant worries for the government. It will make them listen and have to capitulate to some of our demands. And there are places where that's not the case. So we have got to have a smart idea about where we're going to organise and what for. And in my view, we've got to organise on the basis of getting hold of some good old-fashioned industrial muscle in places where it really hurts the economy, so that we can flex our muscles and make our demands felt on behalf of working class people. So that's what I think we've got to do over the coming period. And I'll tell you what, I want to see that happen within the TUC. I think that motion from the CWU is absolutely the ideal motion. It's what we should be doing anyway, and it lays the ground for what we've got to do next. But I've got to tell you this, I'm not going to wait for the TUC. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to come back here in 20 years and have the same argument, thank you very much. No. If we can't get this moving here in the institutions we've got, then frankly, I'm going to see new institutions developed. I'm going to try and build a coalition of people who are willing. Because I don't think people can wait. I don't think we can wait another 10 or 20 years for people to get their marching shoes on and liven themselves up. I think we've got to do it now. Because people, their living standards are falling year on year on year on year. My father saw his wages drop 30% in a few years just up to his retirement. He had a better standard of living than my generation. All our council housing's gone. We haven't got access to education in the way previous generations did. Kids are coming out saddled up with debt to the eyeballs. You know, that's the people that are lucky enough to get it. So I don't think we can wait another 10 or 20 years. I want to see this work. I want to see people coming together and moving away from sectional interests to really come together and organise for effect. And that's how we'll get our political clout back. But if we can't do it here, I'm not going to give up. There is a coalition of willing out there that I believe. And if we can't do it here, then we're going to do it anyway. So that's how I think the future looks. You know, we never know if we're going to get there, but we might as well have a go. What else are we going to do with ourselves? We can sit here and moan about it, or we could get out and have a scrap. And I think that's the best way of learning. In the fight, in the struggle, learning how to move your feet, and eventually you score a few points. Let's hope, and we'll get some wins. There you go.
What we've seen in the last 40 years is just repression. As we stagger towards an authoritarian society, everything from the protest bill to the lobbying act to the shameful, disgraceful indenture of workers in the UK via minimum service levels that won't work and won't be safe, shows a trajectory of all governments. Doesn't matter whether they were Labour or Conservative, because those who didn't repeal the laws are as guilty as those who put them in place. Now we've hoped for the future with the New Deal, if when the Tories go. And I'd like to thank John and Keith for all the hard work they've done, because without guiding the movement and without guiding the party, we would have made some mistakes. There was a risk of throwing some of the baby out of the bathwater, because strange enough, you need some of the legislation. We were so keen to repeal the bloody lot that we could have done some damage to ourselves. But with the right guidance, we're finding the way forward. And it isn't perfect. It's stepping stones, it's building blocks. We would like single states of work from day one. We would like sectoral bargaining everywhere from day one. And sometimes we've got to convince our own movement that is the right thing to do, because they're fearful of change, or maybe think that in some sectors they've got better than. No one wants to stop better than. But what we do want is the right for civil society and trade unions to have the right to secondary action, to be easily go out there and support our colleagues, not be tapped into something that if we haven't dotted an I or crossed a T, that I can't stand my colleagues in the RMT when a wrong is done, or with the NHS down the road, or in some transnational that I'm some sectional that my members are in at a moment in time. We need the right to fight for our class. Some people don't like the word class anymore, I'm getting old. But it is about that. It's about our right to fight for our fellow workers. It's our right to educate our children and our grandchildren about what rights they should have. It's also time to have the right to strike, not to take the right to strike away. We've never had a right to strike in the UK. We've had a right not to be sued or attacked if we jump through all the hoops that we have. When people talk about this democracy, it's a democracy for the rich and for the few, and we've seen that increasingly in the post-pandemic world. We've seen the 80% of the top 350 FTSE companies been profiteering, and they're using that argument to say that wages are driving inflation. If you can't get a bloody pay rise, there is no wage inflation. And if all the wage inflation, some of the things we saw today that we saw as successes in the last 12 months in the hall, many of those were sub-RPI pay rises. A pay rise is when you get more than you had before. When the pound in your pocket buys you more this week than it did last week. When you have more disposable income. When you can do more for your families and for other people than you do now. That's what wage rises should do. I just had the shame of going on Sky TV after Stephen Barclay, and he's been interviewed, and Kay Burley is the most rigorous at that time in the morning, and she said, if the nurses take the pay rise that you're offering, 1 in 4 of them still have to use the food banks where they work. And he said, yes, but we can't drive inflation. In what world did we think it's right that we're still going to starve workers. And of course, I'll be parochial, because you expect me. Let's talk about my industry. We did 14 pay deals the last 12 months. We don't have a problem in Scotland. We don't have a problem in Wales. Don't have a problem in Mersey travel. We don't have a problem in the Elizabeth line. One or two problems in the tube, but it's not great to pay yet. We don't have a problem in open access, don't have a problem in Eurostar. And we're doing deals. What we are experiencing is a political dispute. This is not an industrial dispute. This quite simply is a Tory government that wants to pay and keep the privateers in here at the expense of the workers, and they think they can do that by cutting ticket offices, taking people off the trains, mismanaging the railway, cutting investment and hurting people's futures. Well, I think this government's got to learn something very, very quickly. The strength of feeling in the rail industry across the board is you will not win and we will fight you. And I hate to say this, we don't live in a very polite society. And prior to the pandemic, we were talking about the massive increase in sexual assaults on our railway. We were talking about county lines, we were talking about acid, we were talking about all sorts of things. Now, if you're going to price people off the railway by these fare rises, and you're going to frighten them off the railway because they don't want to use it because it's not a safe place to be, what you're actually trying to do is destroy the infrastructure of this country and destroy our railway system. No, it won't happen, not on our watch, and we will fight and fight till we stop it. Thank you.
I think this recent strike wave has shown that our movement never went away. We've seen incredible action from rail workers, from postal workers, education workers, health workers, food workers, council workers and others fighting back against the cost of living crisis. But as the title of the meeting asks, how do we build on a year of industrial militancy? Because whilst our unions have delivered impressive action and won pay deals that would have been impossible without that sustained action, without those campaigns, the reality is the majority have had to settle for below inflation pay awards. And in reality, as Mick said earlier, what that means is real terms pay cuts. Now let's be really honest, this is not the fault of unions that have smashed ballot thresholds, that have delivered effective action. It reflects a weakness right across our movement. As a movement, we're not in a position where we can demand consistently above inflation pay rises across the entire economy and win them. So we need to look seriously at how we strengthen that movement, and the challenges we face are immense. You only have to look at the fringe meetings at this Congress last night at the IER fringe and CETA fringe. We heard about the anti-trade union laws that are still being extended and imposed on our movement. Tomorrow lunchtime we'll hear about the threats of privatisation to our NHS and what we can do to fight against those. But the big question for us is, if we're going to take on those fights, how do you translate industrial militancy into the rebuilding, the renewing, the expansion of a movement which sadly has not been growing but been shrinking? And I want to argue that right at the heart of that, key to that answer of how we rebuild and renew the movement, is trade union education. Why education? Because through this strike wave, we've seen people taking strike action, joining picket lines, joining in solidarity, young people who've never been on industrial action before, who've never been involved in a movement before. But if what they get is several days of action that then end, or one visit to a picket line to show solidarity that doesn't lead anywhere, that's not rebuilding the movement. How do we take that layer of new activists who've taken action for the first time, who've got involved for the first time, and how do we turn those into the people who become leaders in their workplaces, who go out and organise their sectors, organising not those workers who are already in organised sectors of the economy, but reaching out into the unorganised and under-organised sectors and rebuilding that? How do we take those people and develop the next leadership of the trade union movement? And the reality is, as a movement over the years, we haven't paid great enough attention to that education, what it looks like, how we carry it out, and how we develop leadership at all levels in our movement. that education needs to be broad. It needs to include political education, not just functional, not just how to represent people in a disciplinary hearing, but the world that we live in, the society that we're trying to change. It has to include economic education. People have to understand this cost of living crisis, what drives it, what the solutions are, and how we can fight for them. And it has to include understanding the history of our movement, as we've just heard from our last speaker. If we don't understand the battles of the past, those that we fought and won, but also those we fought and lost, how do we then develop a strategy for the movement going forward? Now, I believe the Morning Star's got an absolutely vital role to play in this. There is nowhere else in the English-speaking world that you can get daily input on what's happening in the trade union movement, what the history of our movement is, where the struggles are now, and where you can have an open discussion about how we develop the strategies in order to take that fight forward. So the Morning Star plays a vital role, but actually we have to play a role in all of our unions in building, developing that education that develops the next generation of actors and activists and leaders throughout our movement. And that's why I'm really, really pleased that the General Federation of Trade Unions last week announced an historic partnership with Strike Map. For those who haven't come across it, Strike Map is a fantastic website and movement which puts those who want to support trade unionism, activists taking strike action right across the country in touch with each other. It maps all of the strikes taking place right across the country and allows people, hundreds of thousands of people, who've used the website in order to send solidarity messages, attend their local picket lines and get active in the movement. But through our partnership, through linking up GFTU and Strike Map, we can take those people who've had that experience, we can bring them into trade union education, and we can develop the militants and the leaders that we need to fight the battles of the future. So let's go back to our unions, let's build that education broad, thoroughly across the entire movement, and please do sign up to support Strike Map. Talk to us at GFTU about how we could support you with your education programme and developing that future for our movement, because that's what we need.
We always, and we are the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, because that particular day, the 18th of June, was the worst example of the police numbers and police violence to date in the strike. It wasn't the only example, and in fact violence continued, and the oppression and occupation of mining villages from Kent to Wales to Scotland continued. But that particular day, the paramilitary nature of the police operation, bear in mind 13 different police forces, all organised, police officers knowing that they could go in and attack from behind, knowing that they could impart violence that would break limbs, fracture skulls, cause what not just were physical injuries but psychological fear. They all knew they could do that because it was going to be allowed, all planned, without mobile phones, without, the internet. So they were talking minute kind of operation, and we know from the papers that we've managed to get released, and for papers that we've managed to find that we think have been wrongly archived, we've actually found them, we know that those orders came from the very top of government. And that is why we are relevant to this meeting today, because you must never ever forget the extent that a government will go to crush whoever they perceive the enemy to be. And I'm afraid the enemy within today is any worker standing up for better pay and better conditions. Mentioned about papers, and this is important, if you go away with one thing from this meeting, because we count on you for spreading our word, is about papers that are embargoed. So the Association of Chief Police Officers, that's basically the very heads of the police at the time, they created a manual which had got really the blueprint for all this operation. It was a secret manual. Not even MPs knew about it at the time. It was only during the trial of the first 15 of the 95 miners charged with riot and unlawful assembly that it came to light. Those papers are embargoed until 2066. We've found out this year papers relating to the Director of Public Prosecution about the miners charged at that time. We found out papers from him are embargoed until 2071. What is the national security issue over that? So next year, as Kaz said, is the 40th anniversary. We mark the event every year with a rally. For the past 2 years and next year it will be held in Sheffield, and please make a note of this date. We are terrible in the trade union movement for not planning and organising things. So the 15th of June, Saturday, we've got it, we've bagged it, it's ours. 15th of June in Sheffield. Go back to your union branches, please. Get organised now. We want to make that day the biggest rally we've ever had in Sheffield. I know that there are already people organising, coaches from London, coaches from Kent. You know, let's get organised this time and send out a massive message. We must never ever forget, people have died without seeing justice. We take inspiration from the success of the Hillsborough families, the success of Shrewsbury. We can get there and we will get there, but without making a loud cry. We don't want things to end like they ended in 1985. We've got to do it this time. Loudest demand for justice for Orgreave, please, next year for the 40th anniversary. Solidarity.
So the last 12 months have seen an amazing amount of workers, mostly key workers, stand together in solidarity and demand better. It's been great seeing all those front page stories in the Star about the different action taking place and some of the really vibrant picket lines. But what next? What about the millions of workers who aren't in trade unions? How do we engage those workers and empower them to demand better too? We've been doing some work with Strike Map, Notes from Below, and most recently Aslef have come into the fold on a project called Organise Now, which is designed to do exactly that. Organise Now is a collective of experienced workers from across the trade union and social justice movements, dedicated to and with track records of helping workers defend their pay and conditions, and to secure better working lines through collaborating with others. It's 12 months old at the end of September, and in that time we have recruited over 200 volunteers from around the movement, from the BFAWU to UCU. Unite to who give up a lot of their time, or a little of their time, to support workers organise. Over 100 workers have contacted us for support from the hospitality, health, social care, education, charity, retail, IT, transport and political sectors, which is just ace. You can tell Sarah's written this one. Workers who are now dipping their toes into trade union activism and organising, and this can only grow. There are other initiatives in place that trades councils are organising that we should also be supporting, because what is clear is people like trade unions at the minute, we have an opportunity for growth. We just need to show them what we're all about. And it was a conversation I had with Doug earlier on, and we've had before, is educating people. Started in 12 months with fantastic interviews on the news by the two Micks, Kevin and Dave, as well as Joe and Sharon. But we can't rest on our laurels and just hope that's enough. Showing workers that they have the power when they come together and what can be achieved is integral to our growth going forwards. We have a huge opportunity right now, and we have to grasp it with both hands and work to build our movement.
The theme of this meeting is building on a year of industrial militancy, and we have seen a huge increase in industrial action over the past year. The stats that came out in the summer showed that 3.9 million days of strike action taken in the year to May was the highest number of strike days since the 1980s. And while that figure is not huge compared to the number of strike days taken in when the movement was at its height in the 70s or 80s, is about 9 times the average number of strike days taken throughout the decade from 2010. So that's a huge increase in strikes. That in itself is actually an achievement for the trade union movement. To actually to beat the Tory ballot thresholds, especially at a national level, when you've got big strike ballots, like the CWUs or the NEUs, that have to cover tens and tens of thousands of members at many, many different workplaces. To beat those strike ballot thresholds is a huge achievement. To then bring all those people out for sustained action over long periods of time, as unions did, actually shows that unions are in touch with their membership, that they're able to organise workplaces, so it's a sign of strength. But of course, more importantly still, those strikes were effective. It's not to say that the strikes have won. And Gawain was absolutely right to highlight that, although that, in some disputes at smaller employers there have been above inflation pay awards, but that's not been the reality for most workers. In the big public sector and essential service disputes, where there have been settlements so far, and obviously in certain areas, particularly on the railway, there have not been settlements, but where there have been settlements, those have generally been below inflation. So that's a real terms pay cut this year, but of course it's also a real terms pay cut on top of 15 years of real terms pay cuts that these workers have faced, amounting in sectors like educational health to workers having lost nearly a quarter of the value of their pay since the Tories came to power in 2010, and it's on top of 45 years in which the share of national product, GDP, going to wages in this country has been shrinking as the share taken in profit and rent has risen. So that's 45 years effectively in which workers are getting a smaller and smaller slice of the pie, and the strategic question for our movement is how do we turn it around? 2023 has not bucked the trend, that trend is continuing. I don't subscribe to the view that because those settlements were below inflation, they amounted to defeats either. Employers in sector after sector have been forced to the table and forced to move their original offers significantly upward as a result of strike action. The government, after being extremely intransigent on all of these strikes and saying there was no more money, turned around almost overnight and announced significant rises in what it was prepared to pay a whole range of public sector workers in different areas. Unions are stronger for having fought and won those increases to the original offers, and when they go to members next year and are talking to them about having to go into the next round of pay talks and whether industrial action will be on the table, workers who know that they got a couple of £1,000 more from the action they took in 2023 are going to be more willing, more confident about coming out again. So it's about building a strategy over several years. All of you, of course, will have read this morning's Morning Star and the interview with Daniel Kebede, the new National Education Union General Secretary, and he talks about a 5-year strategy aimed at pay restoration, trying to claw back all the pay that teachers have lost since 2010. If you look at the British Medical Association and their disputes, the doctors' disputes, they talk again about pay restoration, and they say, we're not saying that we want all of the money we've lost over the 13, 15 years that we've been losing money in 1 year. What we want is the government to show us a plan as to how we get pay back up to that level. The government are determined not to talk about a plan like that because, of course, their whole strategy is that pay should not be restored. Pay should continue to shrink. And that's the Bank of England's policy too. The current fiscal policy of the entire British state is pay erosion. They see lowering pay as key to shoring up corporate profits and accelerating the fragmentation and privatisation of public services. And that's where we need to address the political side. Labour, too, have no plans to raise pay except as a vague and undefined byproduct of economic growth. Keir Starmer has said that when business profits, we all do. But nobody should be allowed to say that with a straight face at a time when the likes of BP are posting record profits literally at our expense through rocketing energy bills. Economic growth does not automatically equate to pay rises. And in fact, over the last 15 years, in Britain, alone among OECD countries, wages have flatlined even in periods where GDP was rising. Our country is in crisis, but not for everyone. We're in what the Sunday Times called a golden era for the super rich. The golden era for the super rich is the other side of the same coin as the falling pay and crumbling services for the rest of us. And Labour is opposed to any expansion of public ownership and any redistribution of wealth. It is in almost every policy area, in fact, committed to continue the current policies of the Conservative government. More NHS privatisation, leaving our polluted waterways in the hands of the water privateers. No wealth tax, no higher income tax on the highest earners, and so on. In fact, no raise to general public spending above current Conservative levels. That is a disgrace. And our movement shouldn't and needn't accept it at a time when we are growing stronger. We've seen in recent years that the popularity of socialist solutions, of the redistribution of wealth, and of the nationalisation of essential services is very, very popular. It gave Labour its largest in 70 years increase in vote share in 2017, and opinion polls continue to show big majorities, even among Tory voters, for renationalising utilities and essential services. So a cost needs to be imposed on the Labour Party and Labour candidates when they do not support union policies. A coherent socialist vision needs to be articulated by our trade union movement and through our trade union movement's newspaper, The Morning Star. And unions should be doing the groundwork, not just for further industrial action to raise pay over the next 5 years, not just for further industrial action to try and bring down or hasten the demise of this Tory government, but for a sustained militancy and confrontations with an incoming Labour government as well, which is shaping up to be a reactionary and anti-union, anti-working class government. We are in this for the long haul, and the political solutions are only coming from this movement. They are not being articulated at Westminster. So that is the challenge that faces us all at the TUC. Thank you.